Hello everyone, my name's Roger Stalley, and for almost 50 years I've been studying and writing about Irish monuments, and I've taken a particular interest in their sculpture and what it tells us about society and about the artists and craftsmen at the time. And today I'd like to talk about some of the wonderful works of art that can be found in our monuments if we just look hard enough. Sometimes it takes a little bit of an effort, but there are some wonderful things and some great surprises there to be seen. And actually, no bigger surprise than the first site I wanted to take you to here at Ardnamulligan in Galway. This is a great tower house, recently restored. The work was carried out in the late 1990s. And as you can see, unlike most of the tower houses, this has actually been covered in spectacular lime wash, very different from the ruined buildings we normally see. But when they were working on this building, there was a real surprise, because in one of the upper rooms, they came across painting. Now, this was painting actually on the walls, former fresco painting, in other words. And this was something which really wasn't, I think, completely expected. Now, sadly, lots of the painting has been lost, but there are plenty of details which show the quality, beautiful quality of these paintings. And I'm just showing you now two heads. One on the left is a particular favorite of mine. Look so carefully at the eyes and the clear lines, the big strong lines. So these must have been wonderfully clear paintings when they were visible within the tower house. Now, if Ardnamulligan has paintings, it's very likely that many other of the tower houses were likewise painted. The great lords of the later Middle Ages certainly were ready to have their, I suppose, their major rooms. I'm thinking of their hall, their main chamber, the feasting halls, if that's what we can call it, have them painted. And there are fragments in some of the other tower, and some are just a very few tower houses, but these at Ardnamulligan are really quite exceptional. And in fact, there's a further surprise, because the figure on the left seems to be a figure of a saint, St. Michael. And so too, perhaps the figure on the right. And he's commonly thought to be St. Christopher. We all know St. Christopher because he was the patron of travelers. And so it's very interesting that within the halls of this castle, there were religious paintings. Now, whether that means that one of the lords, or perhaps one of the family, was a very devout person, presumably it does, perhaps even a member of a religious order, we just don't know. The family who owned it were the O'Shaughnessy's. But the point I'd really like to make is that here in County Galway, there was a very talented painter available to the great lords of the day, somewhere probably in the years around 1530. Now, Ardnamulligan comes from the later Middle Ages, but there's great painting too from much earlier dates. And this takes us to one of the most famous monuments of all in the country, Cashel. And the wonderful little chapel there, which you see on the right of the screen, Cormac's Chapel, built in beautifully cut sandstone in the 12th century. Now, we know that the chapel was finished in 1134 on the instructions of the King of Munster, Cormac MacCarthy, and it's decorated. You can see some of the arcading and wonderful little small sculptures just below the roof line there, the corbels. But the detail I really want to show you is what one can find going inside and looking up, and particularly looking up at the east end of the building, right into the chancel, which we can see there on the left. And you can just see those ribs stretching across the ceiling. But inside and within those ribs and on the ceiling itself is painting in quite bright colors too. But when we look, just as we see it there on the right, it looks nothing more than a sort of jumble. You can just about make out some stonework, I think, but there are some faces there if we look very hard. And we'll go a bit closer. I don't know whether you can see them now, but somewhere just to the left of center, do you see an eye and a crown? And then there's a bearded figure to the right. And they're clothed in magnificent drapery under an arch. And then I'll just show you a couple of details. And there are the faces of the two of them, a younger person and an older one, and they're wearing crowns, they're kings. And so you have to ask, well, what subject would we find in a church, a little chapel like this, involving kings? And in fact, we now know, and there's no doubt about this, that these are the three wise men. And it seems it's the three wise men on their way to the infant, to see the infant Jesus before Herod, when they visited Herod. And we know that from a little piece of the inscription which still survives. Now, this paint has been analysed, and it's of the highest quality, the actual pigments that we used. And it ties up not just, well, particularly, I think, with probably English painting of the date. And we're looking at, as I say, at the 12th century. And the big question is, who paid for these? Was this Cormac McCarthy himself? Well, it seems perhaps not, because the actual design of these paintings seems to go slightly later date, and it's tempting to believe that the chapel had a repaint and was specially prepared for the visit of King Henry II when he visited Ireland in 1171, and of course he came to Cashel. Of course, it's a pity that so little survives, but I think it just gives us an inkling that the churches, and of course many of the tower houses perhaps too, that we see around the countryside, were once gorgeously painted, and inside were just vibrant with colour. The Middle Ages was an incredibly colourful era. They loved colour. And of course, a lot of the cash that was spent on these buildings actually must have been spent on the paintings. Now, the paintings are not the only great thing about Cormac's Chapel. Of course, there's wonderful carvings, but people don't always realise that the carvings, these strange heads you see in so many medieval buildings, particularly inside, they too were painted. And here is one example from Cormac's Chapel at Cashel, a wonderful beast head, as you can see. And they've even painted just to the side of it, the actual walls, a little bit of kind of false masonry jointing there. But the highlight, the great highlight of Cormac's Chapel in terms of art and design must be that fantastic tomb. And this is what it is, a sort of sarcophagus. You can't really see from this picture that it's a massive block of stone which has been hollowed out to make a tomb. And it's so impressive that it must have been obviously for a king, though whether it was for Cormac or not, that's a little bit uncertain. It doesn't actually fit very exactly in the chapel itself, so it seems that it was intended for a different location somewhere on the Rock of Cashel. But it's a marvellous design. As if you look closely up at the top left corner, I think you can just make out the head of a great beast, and his body comes down to the bottom and then curves back up again. And then he's got, complementing him on the other side, he's got another great beast, and we just see the back leg towards the left there. Of course, it's a great pity that it's so badly damaged, but these designs were, on the whole, they had a fair degree of symmetry to them, so it's quite easy to reconstruct what the whole panel would have looked like. So you've got these two great cross beasts. You see the head to the top right in the drawing much more clearly delineated there. And then around them, these swirling ribbons. In fact, they're more than ribbons, because in fact they were snakes. And notice the way the artist has rounded the snakes a little bit more. The bodies of the beasts are quite flat, but they're very deeply cut, and they stand right out from the back of the stone. So in terms of the carver, you know, he's gone hard back into the stone and really cut them in very deep relief. It's a fantastic piece of sculpture, and there's very few examples of great sculptured sarcophagi like this, certainly in Northern Europe. It's quite a rare thing to find, and it must have been a very special commission for whoever whoever made it and whoever was intended to be in this coffin. The coffin is effectively what it is, a huge stone coffin. The actual design with these two beasts and swirls, well, that of course is common enough in the 12th century, because you find it particularly in metalwork. And you just have to think of something like the wonderful Cross of Cong in the National Museum, and you get to see the same spirit, a great beast surrounded by these coils. And the distinctive feature of the style is the way they take a figure-of-8 loop, and it gives the whole design a nice rhythm. It's a little bit more, shall we say, arbitrary. In the Cashel example, it's a bit more free-flowing than it is in the Cross of Cong, but it's the same sort of era. And I think that must be where the sculptor got his inspiration from. But as I say, what a design. It's a really spectacular piece of carving. Of course, if we go further back, it's important to remember that when we look at our great stone crosses, the great high crosses of 2 centuries earlier, we're looking here at Muiredach's cross, it's easy to forget the imagination and the skills that were involved. I'm thinking particularly not just of the actual practical point of carving the sculpture, but also the distinctive designs, the way the designs had to be worked out. And Muiredach's cross, which you see here, is one of the highlights, one of the greatest monuments we have, I think, in the country, certainly one of the greatest early medieval works of art. The figures carved in high relief. In other words, they stand right out from the stone, and they prepared that right from the beginning, and full of interesting detail. This carver was, I think, one of the fantastic artists of Ireland. He, in fact, there was nobody carving to this level anywhere else in Europe at the time, in the early years of the 10th century. Look at the gestures here. This is Christ in the center between the 2 soldiers. This is when he's being presented to the people as the king of the Jews. And you can see he's got a lovely brooch, Christ in the center there, marking him out as a king with fine robes. And the 2 figures are walking, almost tiptoeing, you can see, along the edge of the frame. But this is a very competent, skilled sculptor who is at work. But we have to remember that a carving like this had to start with some sort of drawing. And that's why it's interesting to find here at Kells in County Meath an unfinished cross. Unfinished, we don't know why, whether something went wrong when they were making it, but you can see only a little bit of the carving has been completed. And in certain areas, there are just blank panels, which are clearly meant to take sculpture. And you may wonder why when they're going to carve the stone, do they go to so much trouble to finish off these panels so smoothly? Well, I think the answer must be that those panels were like a drawing board. That's where the initial drawing, the initial design for whatever was going to be sculpted would have been drawn on it, perhaps in charcoal or some similar material. And it's always worth thinking, I think, about the tools that medieval sculptors used when they were doing carvings of this sort. In fact, they haven't changed. They didn't change much from the Roman era almost to the modern day. There's a sculptor's array of modern tools on the right, a lovely punch and a claw chisel there to the left of the sequence, and a medieval sculptor. In fact, the drawing there shows a sculpture from Maastricht, but there are 2 sculptors hard at work with their chisels and punches. But one thing I did want to mention, which is perhaps a bit of a surprise, that one of their favorite tools was a drill. And it was quite an ingenious drill, which you can see in the painting down there at the at the bottom. Obviously, really just the medieval equivalent in a way of the Black & Decker or the electric drills that were so familiar. But the drill was a very important instrument for the medieval sculptor. So I wanted to highlight particularly the skills of the sculptors and the various ways that they handled stone. And here at Kileshin, we see perhaps a somewhat different approach to carving. Now, I've moved on a couple of 100 years from the era of Monaster Boyce and the great crosses. This is 2 centuries later into the 12th century, the Romanesque period. And here, instead of the focus being on carving great crosses, the whole emphasis is on decorating churches, and particularly doorways and arches, like you see here, with a kind of series of arches, as you can see, one inside the other. And Kaleshin is a fantastic example of this. And it's quite clever in a way, because when you look at this, it looks like a magnificent doorway, a very big, wide doorway. But if you actually look at the width of the doorway itself, it's really quite a small doorway. But by having all these separate arches, 4 of them all together, it gives the impression of something being much more impressive than it really is. And each arch is embellished, but not so much with really deep carving, except perhaps on the keystone there, right at the head, right at the top. There's a very fine head, quite strong cheekbones, and you can just make out the eye. It's a tragedy the top of the head is broken, but I think we can see enough to see that this, again, this was a sculptor, again, very talented, but with his own intrinsic style and approach. But if you look at the rest of the arch, you can see that it's all quite finely incised, quite delicately incised. And you have to ask, well, you know, what impression would that have made? Would people really have seen that? And I go back to the subject I began with, which is paint. Almost certainly these arches would have been painted. And so the delicate detail which we see there today would have been highlighted. In fact, in some ways, you could have had a plain arch and painted, but of course, the paint would have gradually decayed and you would have lost the design. And the great thing about sculpture is the actual design and the pattern, they survive. So paint and sculpture, I think, very much went together in the Romanesque era. This is a sculptor, again, as I say, has a very distinctive style. We can find his work in several other buildings of the era, but he loved putting these human heads on the angles. You see, you've got like columns coming up from below, and then we have the capital area in the center and these faces, and they're flanked with various patterns of interlaced, and again, lots of animals. And you can see up above, the arch has these spectacular zigzag patterns, but they're not just plain zigzags, they've got decoration within them. And this is the other side of the arch. And the sculpture on the left there is particularly well preserved. And I think you can perhaps just make out a tiny little dog there amidst the coils to the left. So when you entered this church, as it was, the church at Kaleshin, you've almost aware that they've got these faces looking at you. Who were they meant to be? Well, we don't know. Were they saints? Perhaps they were thought to be saints, but there's no indication of that. But they certainly make the whole building come alive. And there are one or two marvelous details. Here you can see a little bit better of these tiny creatures. But you have to look hard, and of course it's not so easy to see now as perhaps in years gone by when they were painted. And right down below are these wonderful faces, almost hidden in the stone. And I particularly love the example you see on the right there with that profile of a face down the bottom. You can see that he's got quite a prominent, I don't know whether it's chin or beard, and then there's a great piece of, I suppose it's sort of like foliage more perhaps than, well, a scroll growing out of it. So this was a really exuberant doorway, almost you could say a happy doorway, a glorious doorway. And if you imagine it in paint, it must have been fantastic. Now, many years ago, I had a student, a wonderful student, who thought it would be a nice thing to see, well, what would this have looked like in colour? So she had a go, and here it was, and she thought, well, I think perhaps it's a bit more extravagant than it might have been, but at least it does wake us up a little bit, and we to realise that when this doorway was finished, probably about 1160s, something like that, it must have been absolutely magnificent. Well, one of the major pieces in a building now which was carved, and this was particularly so from the Romanesque period onwards, was the capital. In other words, the feature at the top of the column. And it's worth just thinking about capitals a little bit, because one of the tricky things when you're using a column and an arch, the columns are usually circular in some way, but the arch tend to have rectangular forms supporting. So the capital is the bit which really has to effect the transition from one form to another. And here at Boyle, in Boyle Abbey, this is the great Cistercian Abbey in Roscommon. It's a marvellous piece of architecture, but it also has some fantastic carvings too. And I've just picked out my favorite, which is this one. And I wanted to first just point out that you can see that, in fact, there are three sort of small columns or half columns coming up the face of the building, and then the arch up above. And so the sculptor's task is to do a feature which starts at the bottom with three sort of column-like shapes and then goes to a half octagon at the top. And how skillfully he's done it, as you can see here, with it's a symmetrical design. There are two dogs, I think, maybe dogs, in the center, and they've got tails, but their tails, as so often happened in medieval sculpture, their tails miraculously turn into leaves, or palm leaves, it looks like. And then around the side, there's what I think can only be a cockerel with that spectacular tail. But can you see the tail goes off and it goes into a curving, a circular movement with little lobes, very reminiscent, of course, of ancient Irish art. And, you know, you'd have no mistake in saying this is an Irish piece of sculpture, although the theme is a very common one throughout Europe, this sort of thing with animals, and no idea what they're up to. They appear, the dog and the cockerel, if it is a dog or a wolf, maybe, I don't think it's a lion, but possibly could be. Anyway, they're fighting over some prey because there are two little eyes just above them. And so much of this sculpture, of course, it is mysterious. We don't quite know what was in the minds of the sculptors. And we have to remember, nothing is really written down about meaning at this time. And of course, a lot depends just, I think, on oral conversations and chats, little themes that would perhaps have been familiar to people at the time and are completely lost to us. Now, this sculptor, I like to give my sculptors a name, this chap, because you can find him in other area, in other churches and other monuments around what was Connaught, of course, and in particular at Ballintubber Abbey, where there's another great series of carvings by him. But that was the Romanesque age, when so much was focused on the monuments. By the time we move into the later Middle Ages, the focus really, particularly of carving, tends to be funeral monuments. And I'm going a century later now from Boyle, maybe more perhaps to the early 14th century, and taking you to a place that perhaps not many people would visit, or it doesn't look all that interesting. It's a ruined parish church in Kilkenny, but inside, what a surprise, a most fantastic monument awaits you. This is one of the most magnificent sculptures, I think, in the whole of the country. The great Lord of Kilfane, the Cantwell Knight, as he's called, a Norman lord in all his splendour, lying there. Well, I say lying. This is an effigy, a tomb slab, in other words, which would originally have lain on, I think, a small chest horizontally, but it's been propped up against the wall, so we can see him in all his splendour. And you can see he's got a magnificent deep shield, and that's got a coat of arms on it, and it's the coat of arms, the little details of the coats of arms, which indicate who he was, the local lord, a member of the Cantwell family. He's got crossed legs, and many people have often felt, oh, that's a sort of sign of a crusader, somebody who'd been to the Holy Land on the Crusades. It's a very popular comment that's made about them, not just in Ireland, but everywhere. But in fact, that's now known to be completely untrue. And in fact, it was a device used by sculptors, because if you just had the two legs, sounds a bit absurd really, but if you just have the two legs of a figure lying straight out, they don't really look very impressive. Much better to have them crossed in this way. And you can see he's even gone to the trouble of turning the feet, or the feet inwards, and giving a lot more life to the whole figure than would otherwise be the case. And of course, that's one of the ironies of a lot of these tomb monuments, these tomb effigies. They show the figure not in death, but of course in life, as you know, a great lord, serene, powerful. And my word, that's the case with this great figure of the Cantwell. We don't quite know which member of the Cantwell family it was, but there's no doubt that he belonged to that particular family. In fact, if we look more closely, you can see he's got a chainmail, he's got a coif or a headgear of chainmail. His head is turned one way, and if you look down at the legs, of course, they're going, his main leg is going in the opposite direction. That's the technique known as contrapposto, the opposed movements, and it gives a lot of life and energy to these sculptures. And then you can see, as well as that, he's lying, I think, on a sword. You can just see that between his legs. And it's interesting, too, that he's got his chainmail goes right down, it covers his legs. But on top of the chainmail, he wears a light surcoat. And again, I've come back to that question of paint. I suspect that many of the key details here were once painted. So he would have looked even more impressive, I think, than he does today. And you can see he's got a very ingenious sort of, well, it's not so much a gauntlet, a sort of glove made of chainmail, which is fixed to one side. And then down below, he's got rowel spurs. And this is quite a smart thing to have, because they really only came into, they replaced the simple prick, which you used. Whereas the rowel, the little wheel there that you see at the back of his heel, rubbed up and down on the flanks of the horse, they came into fashion really in the later years of the 13th century. And just for good measure, he's standing on a little acorn. Maybe that had some extra significance. So if you're ever anywhere near Kilfane in County Kilkenny, there's a spot which everyone should just go to see. It's possible, of course, that the sculptor had nothing much to do with the design, but and sometimes we forget that all these sculptures had to start off with a drawing. And we're reminded of this by a marvellous tomb monument at Jerpoint. It's not that easy to see, because here it's really just a drawing. It is some sort of monument, presumably it just laid, if not flat on the ground, just on a low raised chest of some sort. It's known generally as the Brothers, and it's a fantastic piece of 13th century drawing with two young knights. And again, you can see they've got a lot of chainmail, and you notice the ribbon around their knees to keep the chainmail from sagging down, and then their drapery and their surcoat is kind of floating all over the place, and they've got their swords upraised. And then lovely contrast between the two. One's got a magnificent helmet, and the other one has just got this sort of head cap or coif of mail. So the way they interact is very unusual to find a drawing like this on a tomb monument. And whether it was indeed, and it could well be, two brothers, two companions anyway, who presumably perhaps died together. It's tempting to think so, but that, of course, is yet again unknown. Now, as the Middle Ages wore on, these two monuments got ever more impressive, and we see a fair number of them, particularly from the 15th and the 16th century. I'm taking you here to Kilcooley Abbey in Tipperary, where one of the Butler family, you can see him lying on the top of the tomb chest there in his magnificent armour. And the chest now has become decorated in a fantastic way, this time with little designs, little images of the apostles. And each of the apostles of Christ has his own attribute or insignia telling us who he is. So you can see the one on the extreme left is quite easy, because that's St. Peter there, holding giant keys of heaven, Peter, the so-called guardian of the keys of heaven. And then third in from the left, we've got a figure there with a staff and a little purse, and that can only be one person. The familiar figure, he's also got a little hat, and that's St. James, because that's how St. James of Compostela was always depicted in the Middle Ages. And of course, the pilgrimage from Ireland, as across most of Europe, that is, to Compostela, was one of the great activities, one of the great trips that people like to make in the Middle Ages. So that's a memory. The way the sculpture is done, the way St. James is depicted, refers quite directly to that. And here you see him more clearly there on the left. And I think you can almost make out on his little bag the scallop shell, which was a symbol of the pilgrimage to Compostela. Here is the butler knight up above. Now his head sadly smashed, but look at now the chainmail has gone except for that area around the chest. He has particular protection on the shoulders, you'll see, and the elbows, and then it's plates, it's metal plates. The armor is of a much later type, but all meticulously carried out. And you can imagine that these great lords, when they were commissioning their tombs, they would be very attentive to having exactly the right details. And now look at his gauntlets and so on, all the details of his sword, all very carefully delineated. It's a magnificent tomb, but even more impressive because it's a much blacker, or now it appears anyway, a much blacker stone was used, is in St Canice's at Kilkenny with another one of the Ormond knights. This is Piers Butler, the Earl of Ormond, who died in 1539. And here the limestone has a polish and it just makes him look so powerful but so serene. It's an idealized face. See, there's almost a hint of a smile there, and a very impressive helmet in this case with the visor held up. So these lords were depicting themselves in death as almost idealistic, surreal figures. Now, another example of one of these great tombs is here at Strayed. And by this stage, instead of having a separate chest out in the open, what we've got now is a huge canopy over the top with the most fantastic tracery. And here is the donor whose tomb, he's the man who paid for the tomb, he's kneeling there with saints. And these have always been a bit of a puzzle because the first one in front of him appears to be an archbishop with a mitre. And then we've got St. Peter, the keys are there. And then here's the donor, and the donor is wearing or hanging from his robes something very curious. And I think nobody has really worked out for certain exactly what this is. But I think the favorite story is that maybe he was something to do with maybe it's something to do with the wool industry, a sort of carding technique for thinning the wool, but we just don't know. But I think this man must have been an active pilgrim, because the Archbishop there is most likely to be Archbishop Thomas of Canterbury. So it looks as though he went to Canterbury. The next two saints are Peter and St. Paul, and they're the saints of Rome. And then we get 1, 2, 3, the three wise men holding their gifts. And the church or the cathedral in Cologne claim to have the relics of the three wise men. So I think this man is telling us about all his travels, reminding perhaps the Lord above that he had been to pilgrimage. He's been on at least 3 pilgrimages, or maybe he took all these sites in one great trip. And then perhaps more strangely, another tomb in Clare Island, a very remote spot, another fantastic canopied tomb, but not with any sculpture there. But what we do get extraordinary is the ceiling is painted, probably as part of the same idea. This was a great commemorative little chapel for presumably the Lord of Clare Island. Now, what would you expect to find painted on the ceiling of a chapel? Well, again, you'd presumably expect to find Christian scenes of one sort or another, and that's exactly what you don't get, because you look up at Clare Island, and here from the later Middle Ages are some, I suppose they're probably amongst the best preserved paintings that we have from medieval Ireland. And at the top, I think it's a shepherd, or at least it's a herdsman with animals all around. There's a rider down below and other animals. And over to the right, there's a curious figure with a bow and arrow. And then a strange sort of dragon-like creatures between the 2 ribs there. And that's a better detail. You can see the herdsman perhaps somewhat more clearly in that shot. And then there's this fantastic, very damaged, alas, but there he is, no doubt, the man who paid for this chapel, or paid for the tomb at least, in all his glory, with a long coat of mail in this case, riding on a spectacular red horse. So We started by looking at paintings in a castle where we might have expected to find hunting scenes and riding scenes and feasting scenes, and we found Christian scenes. And now we're in a chapel where you would have expected to find Christian subjects, and what do we find? We find hunting scenes and herdsmen and cattle and so on, the secular subjects. So it just shows that the world of the faith and normal life, they were all completely interspersed. But I'm finishing now. Oh, I've forgotten, I'd mentioned that. This is a fantastic piece of drawing, a greyhound or something equivalent. And just, again, we're still at Clare Island, and you can see the extraordinary energy and tension, particularly in those back legs, as the real sense of a terrific movement in this. So this was a Clare Island, the chapel there was a real celebration, I think, of the life of this and what occupied the thoughts of this great Lord, whoever he was, who paid for it. And finally, hunting, of course, there it is. Again, we're still on Clare Island. But I wanted to end with a comparison, really. We looked at the Earl of Ormond here in his idealised state in Kilkenny, but that's not how all lords like to be remembered, or at least felt was appropriate to have on their grave. There was a fashion, not terribly popular perhaps in Ireland, but it's found in a number of places, where rather than showing the body in all its earthly glory, you did the opposite. And there were these scenes, they're known as appropriately as cadaver effigies, and they show the body, the human body in its state of decay. And of course, that's really a way of reminding everybody who looks that life is short. And of course, that it's a warning, I suppose, that earthly pleasures will not last. And the only way to salvation is through faith. But I'd like to turn it from worrying too much about the fate of the corpse to the skill of the sculptor, because this is a very deep relief piece of carving. And wherever you look, the hollowed eyes, and you see around the chin of the figure, there's a nasty worm or something. There's the nasty beasts, the snakes and worms further down. There are toads, and these are all the creatures who it's supposed would devour the corpse in death. But actually, in many cases, the grisly little worms and creatures were identified with particular sins, almost as if your sins would catch up with you in death. But of course, the principal thing is that it's a warning that life is short. Earthly pleasures will not last. And I feel that that is the most, it's a fantastic piece of sculpture, of course. Again, propped up on its side, it would have originally been lying flat, but it's a fantastic piece of sculpture in its own right, technically, as well as imaginatively. But what a contrast that makes to the Kilkenny sculpture, where we have the Earl of Ormond in his prime, and then at Beaulieu, we in County Louth, we have a very different approach to death. So I hope I've said enough to convince you all that there are many extraordinary things to be found if one goes searching in the great monuments of Ireland, if we look hard enough. And I particularly think it's always worthwhile just asking ourselves, how did those unknown artists and craftsmen work out their designs? And I think with sculpture, it's always important to remember that it must all have started with some sort of drawing. And of course, it involved a great deal of imagination as well as skill.